Welcome back to the HTML5 Beginners course, Lesson 8, where we'll discuss forms. In this lesson, we'll be covering quite a lot, including creating HTML forms, inputs for user text, creating list selects, creating number inputs, date inputs, radio buttons, checkboxes, and a submit button. For this lesson, I've created a new file, and I've called it 08 forms.html, created our image template for the HTML document, and named it Lesson 8. So, forms are how we gather information from our users. And to create a form in HTML, we first use the form tag. And our form is not going to do anything because we haven't learned JavaScript or how to communicate with a backend server. This example will just show us how to create the visual components of the form. So we can delete now our action element attribute there. Open up our form. Inside of our form, we'll first create text input. And to create a text input, we're going to first create a div because all of our lines will be inline elements. So, create a div around our text input, and then we need to create an input. And we want the type attribute to be text. And we'll say this is for a username. So we'll add ID of user, and we'll add a placeholder attribute, and we'll do username as well. Now, we probably want some kind of label so that the user knows what this input is for. So we'll create a label element. And our for attribute, it's for our username. We can then come in here, and for our label, we'll say username. Let's save it and go take a look at our form so far in Live Server. Now we can see we have our first form input field for our username with a title and our input box. Okay, now let's create another type of user input. Now let's create an input for email. We'll again wrap it in a div. We'll add a label. We'll have that label for email. And we'll put email as our label. Create another input. This time, our input will be for email. Our ID also be for email, and our placeholder, we will write email at email.com. Now, as you notice, the email and text inputs are almost identical, except for the type of email. And that will allow us later to check for validity of the email address. So let's take a look at our email input in the browser. Now we see here we have our email input as we expected. Same, we have our label and our input box. Next, let's create a text input area. And for this, let's imagine we're creating a place where a user can enter, say, a blog post. So we'll create our div and create a label. And we'll have that label for blog post. And in our label, let's call it blog post. Below that, create a new type of input called text area. And post. Blog post And we can set the size of our text area with columns and rows. This text area input will be 30 columns by 10 rows. Let's save it and go take a look. And now we've created an input box that allows us to put perhaps a paragraph in the input box. And it's 30 columns by 10 columns is how we generated our height. And we see we have our label and our input area. Now let's take a look at another type of input. Here we'll create a drop-down menu where a user can select multiple options. So let's imagine here that we're creating a list for a user to log in either as a user, admin, or guest. So we'll start out with our div tag and we'll add our label. And we'll do user type and user type. Then below that, we're going to create a select element using select, and for the name, we'll go with user type, and the same for the ID. And then we'll open up our select bracket so we can nest inside our options. So do option, and for this value we'll say guest and have guest as our displayed information. We'll add another option and we'll do user, and a third option that we'll call admin. Let's save it and go take a look. Now we can see we've got our user tab, the drop-down menu, and it gives us 3 different options as we expected. Now we'll create a number input. So again, starting out with our div tag, and we'll add a label, and we'll make it for age. Then we'll add our input, and for type we'll do number, and we'll add a few more attributes. We'll add our ID, we'll do number, or age, I'm sorry, and we'll do a minimum of, let's say, 16, and a max, say 99. That'll set our fields where the minimum input can be 16 and the maximum of 99. So let's go take a look at our numbers. Now we have our number input, and we can go into it and type a number, and we can hit our down arrow and it'll go down to 16, and we can hit our up arrow and it will go all the way up to 99 as we expected. Okay, let's go take a look at how to create date inputs in HTML. So to create a date input, let's begin with our div again and do a label, and we'll do DOB for and date of birth, the label. And now we can do input type, change it to date, and ID, we're going to do DOB. Now let's go take a look at our date input. And as we can see here, we've got our date input, and we can do a date, or we can click on the icon and a calendar will come up where we can select a date. And now we can create radio buttons that are useful for giving users options. So we'll create our div tag again and a label. We'll have this label be for user level. And user level our text display, and an input type radio, and we'll give it an ID of user level and a value of bronze. And then if we want our selection to have a label next to it for bronze, we will write bronze just outside the tag. And let's copy and paste a couple more times. Let's change this one to silver and this one to gold. Then we'll save that and go take a look in our browser at our radio buttons. And now we can see our radio buttons for user level with our 3 options, and we can click on them and select an option. Next, we'll take a look at checkboxes. So for checkboxes, we'll do the same and create our new div. We'll create an input, in this case, of checkbox. And inside there, we'll do an ID of remember. And we'll add the text, remember me. We'll save it and we'll go take a look at our checkbox now. Now, as we can see, we've got our checkbox. We can also click, check. And next we'll take a look at how to create a button in our form. Okay, to create our button, we need to create a button element. And in that button element, we're going to give it a type of submit. And we'll do submit as the label. And we'll go take a look at our form now in the browser. Now in our browser, we have a form with several items we can use for input. Our submit button. That's not a very pretty form, but you'll learn more about styling in the CSS course. In our next lesson, we'll take an introduction to styling and look at our next steps after HTML.